Chapter 1. Margaret O'Reilly took a deep breath. She had the four youngest of the Miller children, not so fondly known as the demon horde to all of Beckham, Massachusetts, in her class, and she was ready to strangle every single one of them. Why would a 17-year-old boy put a snake in his teacher's desk? Why would he even think about doing something so ridiculous? I'm going to send a note home to your parents. I need one of them to sign it and send it back to prove that they've read it. Who wants to carry it home? Meg asked, her voice stern and angry. None of the four children from the family would even look at her, let alone agree to take the note. Fine, I'll walk over there after school. She knew the children didn't want her in their home. They'd made that clear in the past. Eventually, the youngest of the children, a 10-year-old girl named Ida, raised her hand. I'll take it home. But the others will probably throw me on the ground and take it from me before I get it there. She had her blonde hair in braids, and she was the best behaved of the four, though that wasn't saying much. The words didn't shock Meg one little bit. She'd seen what the demon horde was capable of, and she was downright sick of them. When the school day ended, she gave Ida the note and made her promise to have it signed. As soon as Ida walked off, Tom, the eldest of the demon horde still in school, sauntered to her desk, a newspaper in his hand. I'm sorry you don't like my brother and sisters and me, teacher. Meg glared at the worst of the four. No, you're not. You're not a bit sorry, or you wouldn't behave as you do. Please just go home and leave me alone. She was tired of looking at him. He set the newspaper on her desk. Since you're such a failure at teaching, I thought you might want to go see my sister. Her name is Elizabeth Tandy, and she lives in town on Rock Creek Road in the biggest, nicest house you ever did see. She sends women out to be mail-order brides. You know, women who aren't good at anything else and can't find themselves husbands. She sends them. Meg closed her eyes and counted to 10 again. When she finally opened them, she was alone. In the month since she'd started teaching there, the Miller children had locked her in the outhouse and tipped it over, put 3 reptiles, 6 rodents, and 2 amphibians in her desk, started 4 fist fights, done no schoolwork, and sent a letter to the school board saying she wasn't pretty enough to teach there. Why, she didn't know. She knew for a fact she wasn't ugly. Probably just their way of trying to chase her off. She looked down at the newspaper with the words Grooms Gazette emblazoned across the top. Maybe she was stupid, but she was actually considering it. She read through a few of the ads, some were funny, but there was one that seemed downright intriguing to her. North Dakota farmer needs a woman for housework and companionship. 28 years old, not ugly, and has all his own teeth. See Elizabeth Tandy on Rock Creek Road in Beckham, Massachusetts, or write to Mr. Lars Borgen in Sunset, North Dakota. Well, if Mrs. Tandy is the older sister of the demon horde, maybe I can talk to her about her poorly behaved siblings while I chat with her about Mr. Lars Borgen, she said to the empty schoolroom. She got up and swept the floor, making sure the fire was banked before heading into town. She should have enough time to make it to town and back before it was too dark to see her hand in front of her face. She locked the door and headed toward town, dreading meeting another member of the Miller family. Surely they weren't all as pleasant as the ones she'd already met. When she got to Rock Creek Road, she realized she wasn't going to be able to make it back to her house beside the school before dark. She needed to do whatever she could to get away from her terrible situation, though. The dark could be faced once. The demon horde could not be faced for a full year. She knocked on the door of the huge house, intimidated by the sheer size of it. She'd grown up in a large house, but it hadn't belonged to her family. Papa had been the gardener and her mother the cook. They were so proud that she was teaching. Hopefully they'd understand what the demon horde was driving her to do. The door was opened by a tall blonde man. May I help you? Yes, I'm here to see Elizabeth Tandy. Meg suddenly wished she'd taken the time to wash her hands and face. She could see soot all over her hands from cleaning up the mess the children had made when they had dumped it all over the classroom, in an effort to cover her with soot. It had worked beautifully. "Is she expecting you, miss?" Meg shook her head. "No, she's not. It's Miss O'Reilly. I'm here about her newspaper." The man nodded. "Right this way, Miss O'Reilly. Would you care to wash your hands and face before you see her? There's a sink right through here." He opened the door to the bathroom for her, and Meg ducked inside thankfully. She quickly washed her hands and face and stepped back out into the hallway. "Thank you. It's not a problem. Mrs. Tandy is in her office." He walked to a room at the back of the hall and opened the door for her. "Elizabeth, there's a Miss O'Reilly here to see you." Mrs. Tandy stood and turned toward the door. Meg was immediately struck by her beauty and her extremely pregnant state. She looked like she could have the baby she was carrying any minute. "Please don't stand." Elizabeth laughed, her eyes sparkling. "I promise, the baby won't fall out on his head if I stand. Bernard? Would you please bring us some tea and cookies?" As soon as the man had left the room, Elizabeth grinned at Meg. "I find any excuse a good one for tea and cookies at this point in my pregnancy." She patted her belly with obvious affection. "Please sit down, and we'll chat." Meg took a seat on the couch, while Elizabeth moved to sit beside her. "It's nice to get out of that awful desk chair for a bit." "You want to be a mail-order bride?" she asked. "Yes, I do. I'm the teacher at the local school, you see, and the demon horde, your siblings, are amusing themselves by making my life miserable." Elizabeth put her hand over Meg's. "I'm so sorry. My younger siblings are truly rotten to the core. I don't spend any more time with them than absolutely necessary." "So you know?" Elizabeth laughed. "How could I not? I lived with them. Trust me, they've done nothing to you, their teacher, that they haven't done to me." Repeatedly. She nodded at the copy of the Grooms Gazette that Meg was still clutching with a death grip. "Did you choose someone?" "Yes, him." Meg pointed at the advertisement she'd read back in the schoolhouse. "Ah, yes. Mr. Borgen. So you want to be a farmer's wife?" Elizabeth asked with a smile. "I want to be anywhere doing anything that doesn't involve your brothers and sisters. I would become a coal miner if I thought it would help me." Elizabeth chuckled softly. "I don't think you'd be well suited to that particular vocation. Let me find the letter Mr. Borgen sent me, and you can see if you still want to go to North Dakota." She stood and walked to her desk, quickly finding the letter and bringing it back. The door opened then, and the same man came back with cookies and tea. "Bernard, why don't you join us?" Elizabeth asked. "Oh, I couldn't." "Of course, you could." Elizabeth grinned at him. "I insist." Bernard took the chair behind the desk, looking very uncomfortable. "I don't feel like it's my place to be in here when you're interviewing future brides," he said softly while Meg tried to concentrate on the letter and not on the conversation going on around her. "It wasn't your place when you were my butler. As my husband, it's your place." Meg blinked a couple of times. Elizabeth had married her butler? She'd assumed Elizabeth had moved there with her husband and had married wealth. How had one of the Millers gotten so much money? She turned back to the letter, forcing herself to start over so she'd know what it said. "Dear potential bride. I'm a farmer in North Dakota, a beautiful state. I moved here in 1897 to be a farmer in a land that wouldn't be nearly as harsh as my homeland of Norway. Norway was a wonderful place, and I miss it a lot, but the land was not meant for farming, so it was not meant for me. I am looking for a wife who is between the ages of 19 and 22. I would like her to be able to cook and clean well. She must not be bothered by being alone. I live a 2-hour drive from the nearest town, and I don't have time to run to town every few days to amuse a bride. I need companionship and someone to cook, but I don't ever plan to fall in love with my bride. If you see yourself as a woman who will never be able to be happy without love, I'm not the right groom for you. If you are interested in marrying me, please write me a letter. I am anxious to have a wife before winter sets in. Sincerely, Lars Borgen. Meg blinked a couple of times after reading the letter. He wanted a wife, but he didn't ever plan to love her. She wasn't sure she wanted that, but she could change his mind. She was sure of it. He was a better candidate for a husband than the other men she'd read about in the paper. I'll take him. Elizabeth laughed, handing her a pencil and some paper. Go ahead and write him a quick letter, telling him about yourself. It'll take about a month to get a response. No one has been interested after reading his letter, so I'm certain he'll choose you. A month? I have to teach the demon horde for another month? Meg wanted to throw a fit worthy of the worst 2-year-old at that news. Instead, she closed her eyes. I can do that. Bernard coughed, obviously covering a laugh. Oh, don't hide the laugh. She knows they're my brothers and sisters. Rotten children that they are. Elizabeth patted her belly. You are going to be raised with rules. I will not have a mannerless hooligan for a child. Do you understand me? Meg even giggled a bit at that. Your brothers and sisters should be beaten. Often. I've told my mother the same thing. Often. Meg couldn't believe she liked the older sister of the demon horde nearly as much as she did. What was wrong with her? She'd expected to hate any member of the children's family on sight. She wrote the letter, daringly signing it, Your future bride, Margaret. She had no idea how he'd react to that, but she had to get out. She was willing to be daring and even a bit cheeky if that's what it took. When she finished, she handed the letter to Elizabeth. I'll send Bernard to the schoolhouse when your letter arrives. Go ahead and tell the school board you're leaving and why. I'm sure they'll have another victim all lined up before you leave. Meg choked on her laughter. Victim? Is that what they call teachers around here? Only the ones forced to teach my younger siblings. Bernard stood when Meg did. I'll see you home, Miss O'Reilly. It's getting dark, and there's no need for you to walk all that way. It could be dangerous. Meg laughed. I just agreed to take a train more than 1,000 miles to meet a stranger? What could be more dangerous than that? I've investigated that stranger. I assure you, he's not dangerous as far as anyone can tell. You're in more danger teaching the demon horde. I mean, my brothers and sisters-in-law. He walked over and bent down, kissing Elizabeth on her lips. I'll be back soon. Thank you, Meg said to Elizabeth on her way out. You're welcome. I'm happy to help anyone get away from the demon horde. Asterisk. Lars stopped at the mercantile to pick up his monthly supplies and see if he'd ever gotten a response to his advertisement for a mail-order bride. He'd sent his letter out more than 3 months before, but he hadn't had one single letter in return. Did no one want to marry a Norwegian immigrant farmer who lived in the middle of nowhere and swore he'd never love them? He chuckled to himself as he realized just what a horrible prospect he was for a husband. Surely someone was in a bad enough situation they'd write him back eventually. He hoped. It probably wouldn't be before winter, though. He picked out the things he needed before going to the counter to pay. Any mail for me? He asked, expecting the owner, George Collins, to say no as he usually did. Actually, yes, there is. It looks like a woman's handwriting, too. George was the only person in town who knew Lars had sent for a mail-order bride. Lars took the letter, half expecting it to bite him. Really? Someone had responded? He opened the letter with his hand shaking a bit. He wasn't sure he could spend the winter alone again. Last year, he'd almost gone insane, staring at the endless piles of snow out the window. He read the letter slowly, and almost laughed aloud at the closure. Dear Mr. Borgen, I'm sure you were trying to scare off potential brides by saying you would never fall in love, but I assure you, after teaching school for over a month, I do not scare easily. I've had snakes in my desk and fist fights break out in my classroom. Being married to you sounds like a veritable paradise in comparison. I would love to be your bride. I'm 19 years old, and my parents emigrated from Ireland before I was born. I've lived in Massachusetts my entire life, and I love it here, but I need to be away from the evil children that I currently teach. Well, truly, only 4 of them are evil, but that's 4 too many for my taste. I'm a good cook, and I can keep house like no one you've ever seen. I will lick the floors clean if that's what it takes to get me out of this awful school. Please say you'll take me. I'm tall and slim, and I don't make children run away screaming into the night when they see my face. What more could a man ask for at this point? Your future bride. Margaret. He needed a woman who was desperate. Well, he'd definitely found one this time. George, I need a pencil and paper to write her back. She's willing to come. George handed him a pen and paper and watched as Lars quickly scrawled out a letter. He added some money, and then he rushed out of the store to buy a train ticket. When Lars came back minutes later, George had already boxed his supplies for him. You need help with these, Lars? No, thanks, George. I got it. He handed George his letter. Get that out as soon as you can. I'm expecting a bride in a little over 3 weeks. Will do. And may she be as sweet and precious a woman as you've ever seen. Lars waved on his way out, putting his supplies in the back of the wagon before climbing in to make the 2-hour drive home. He was thankful Margaret had answered his letter. She seemed like a woman with a sense of humor, and that was important to him. When she found out he really never planned to love her or have any tender affections for her, she wouldn't be pleased. That was simply not to be helped, though. He'd buried his heart in his back field with his wife and stillborn son. No, there was no love left in him to give her. He'd give her children, though. That's all he had left. He thought of nothing but his sweet Olga the whole way home. They'd married in Norway before he'd found out about the railroad's offer for farmers. There weren't enough men in the West, so the Northern Pacific Railroad had offered cheap package deals for farmers to buy land and get transportation all for one lump sum. He jumped at the chance, bringing his new bride with him. Lars had only been 19 when he'd crossed the ocean with Olga in tow. She'd lost the baby she was carrying while they were on the ship, and had begun to cry and beg him to return home then. He couldn't, though. How could a man pass up the opportunity to work land that was meant to be farmed? The land in all of Scandinavia had been brutal to farmers for centuries. No, he knew he was doing the right thing. Now he wondered if he'd been closer to home when Olga had first gone into labor, if she'd have lived. If their son would have lived? No more would he worry about those things. Mail-order brides were easy to come by here in the United States. If this one died, he'd just send for another. There would be no love involved. There couldn't be. Lars Borgen no longer had a heart. He'd go visit Olga and their son later, and tell her of his plans. He knew she'd understand, though. How could she not? She knew he needed a son. He would plead her forgiveness, even as he told her he was marrying another. He loved her too much to ever care for another. She would understand that. Chapter 2. It was Meg's last day teaching at the school outside of Beckham. A replacement had been found, and this time they'd found a male teacher who was known for not sparing the rod, or the ruler as the case may be. He would do much better with the unruly demon horde, she was certain. She hoped Bernard came for her soon, because she had enough money to stay at the boarding house in town for 2 weeks, but after that, She wasn't certain what she would do or where she would go. Maybe she should look for a job as soon as she got off work. Surely someone in town needed a cook. She was one of the best cooks around, thanks to her mother's tutelage. She'd also make a wonderful nanny to anyone who didn't have the last name Miller. Why she'd even work for the demon horde's older sister if it came to that. She'd spent most of her extra money for the past month working on new clothes that were more suited to a farmer's wife than the ones she wore. Her school clothes were all the latest style, and they certainly weren't right for anything but going to church for a farmer's wife in North Dakota. North Dakota. It might as well be the North Pole. She hadn't dared tell her parents she might be leaving her post as a teacher to travel across the country and marry a stranger. No, it would be better if she wrote them after the fact. They wouldn't be pleased. Not even a little bit. After she'd dismissed school for the day, thankful to see the backs of the demon horde for the last time, she swept the floor in the schoolroom and erased the blackboard. She meant to leave the school as neatly as she'd found it. She was just finishing up when she heard the door open, and she turned, expecting one of the demon horde to have returned to torment her one last time. Instead, it was Bernard Tandy. "Mr. Tandy. Does this mean my letter came back?" He smiled as he extended it to her. "It did. Elizabeth said I should wait for you to read it, in case you needed a ride into town." "I need a ride into town, no matter what this says. Today is my last day of work, and I need to get my things out of the house provided for me, and move into town tonight. I've quit my job rather than lose my mind." "I understand. I hope the letter holds good news for you." Meg moved to her chair to read the letter, trying to ignore the large man prowling the room. "Dear Margaret. You sound like exactly the type of woman I am looking for. I've enclosed a train ticket for you, leaving Beckham, Massachusetts on Saturday, October 31st and arriving at the station in Mandan, North Dakota on November 6th. I'll be waiting for you in Mandan, and we will make the drive to Sunset to marry. I look forward to your arrival. Your future husband, Lars." Meg did her best to contain her glee. One night in a boarding house wouldn't be nearly as taxing on her finances as a week would. "I have a train ticket for 8 tomorrow morning." "Oh good. I'll give you a ride to town. Why don't you stay the night with us rather than wasting your money on the boarding house? We have plenty of room. Of course, you'll sleep better in the boarding house, because there my son won't keep you up all night." Meg's face lit up at the news of the baby. "Oh, congratulations. I'm so happy for you. What did you name him?" "Benjamin. Shall I follow you to your house?" "It's no longer mine, but yes, please. And I'd love to spend the night. I would prefer not to spend the money on the room, if that's really all right with you." "Of course. We've had several brides stay with us, sometimes for as long as a month. It's not a problem. Thank you." She finished up the last of her tasks and picked up her bag. "Let's go to the house. I am all packed and ready to go." She had only 2 bags, so she could have easily carried them to town, but it was already getting very cold, and she didn't want to be out past dark. They walked next door to the teacher's house and got her 2 bags. She closed the door of the house sadly. It had been her first place to live alone, and she'd gotten a taste for independence. She would miss the house and the freedom it had brought. She didn't say much on her ride to town, having little to say to the man beside her. Instead, she watched the scenery as she passed it, wondering how different North Dakota would be. She'd been raised in Boston and had never lived outside Massachusetts. When they got into town, he drove straight to Rock Creek Road and she went in. Elizabeth wasn't in the room she'd first met her in, and instead she was in a parlor at the front of the house, holding the baby. Meg was the youngest of the children in her family, so she had no experience with babies. She knew the basics of how to take care of one, of course, but she'd rarely had the chance to hold one. She walked into the room where Elizabeth sat on the sofa, taking a seat beside her. "Thank you for allowing me to stay here tonight. It will help me a lot." Elizabeth frowned. "You're welcome to stay here as long as it takes for your train to leave." Bernard wasn't supposed to offer for just one night. "My train leaves first thing in the morning," Meg said with a grin. "He's a handsome baby." She peered at the little boy on Elizabeth's lap. Elizabeth trailed her finger along Benjamin's cheek. "I think so. I'm so happy he's finally here, and I can hold him." "Do you want more children?" "I want a dozen or so, but I'll be content with whatever God gives me." Elizabeth's eyes met Meg's. "I promise I will not let them act like the demon horde." "I couldn't imagine. I was quite happy to see their backs leave my classroom for the last time today. Honestly, I've never been so happy." Meg shook her head. "I have never dreamed children that poorly behaved existed. How did you turn out all right when your siblings were so awful?" Elizabeth shrugged. "The oldest four were raised differently. I'm the second eldest. Most of the younger ones are actually good people now that they're out from under my parents' influence. There were 14 of us total. Mama had 2 more after my oldest sister was already married. I'm the youngest of 7, and I can't imagine acting like that." "I know. I don't think most people can. I really am sorry. I hate it when people realize we're all related." "Well, I promise not to think less of you for it," Meg said with a grin. "I'm actually very impressed with your business and very thankful that you found me a place to go and a man to marry. He sounds like he's a very good man." "I'm sure he is. I have a network of matchmakers around the country and we are always checking out the men for each other, making sure they'll treat the women well." Elizabeth looked down at the baby. "Usually when I match a woman, I go to the train station with her and talk to her about marriage. I need you to know that if your husband hits you or hurts you in any way, you don't have to stay. You have the right to leave, and you would have a place back here, if only until you get back on your feet." "Does that happen?" Meg asked, surprised. "It could, so we tell our brides about the possibility. It hasn't so far, because we investigate each groom before sending a bride out to him." Meg nodded. "I see. Well, thank you for the offer." She really couldn't see coming home with her tail between her legs, but she couldn't see staying in a situation where she was being abused either. She'd have to think about that when and if the time came. "I won't be able to go with you in the morning, because I just had the baby last week." "That's fine. I can walk. It's not far from here." "Did you bring a lot with you?" Elizabeth asked. "Because Bernard would take you if you had a lot of things." "Oh, no ma'am. I have 2 carpet bags and a small bag of teaching supplies. I don't know why I'm even holding on to them, but I guess it's so I can teach my own children someday. It sounds like the farm is way too far out for there to be a school near." "That's probably true. If you want Bernard to walk with you anyway, he certainly will. He's done it many times when I couldn't for whatever reason." "You must place a lot of brides." Elizabeth laughed. "You wouldn't believe me if I told you. Why, I once placed a couple dozen women all at once, because of a factory fire. It's amazing how quickly we can find places for people when we really need to. I do admire the work you're doing. I'm pretty proud of my business. I inherited it from the last matchmaker who ran it. She herself went west and married. I'm still in touch with her quite often, but mostly I'm on my own now." Meg stood. "I'm sure I'm keeping you from more important things. Where am I staying?" Elizabeth gave her directions to her room. "We'll have supper in about an hour. Bernard and I would love for you to join us." "Thank you. I will." Meg walked up the stairs and found the bedroom Elizabeth had sent her to. It was small, but very luxurious. She had never stayed anywhere so nice in her life. She wondered if she'd spend the rest of her life wanting to go back to Beckham, just because of the memory of it. She looked through her things, wondering if she was taking too much, but really she had 3 dresses for working around the house, and 3 for Sunday. It was a lot more than she'd ever dreamed of having. She only had 1 apron, but she'd bought fabric for another. She could sew on the train. Why, it would help her stay busy. There was a knock on the door, and a woman's voice called that supper was ready. Meg jumped up and hurried down the stairs, happy to be included. She'd had a lot of lonely nights in the teacher's house. Asterisk. The following morning, Meg was up well before the sun, as was her habit. She dressed and made sure she had everything together for the train trip for the 4th time in the past 12 hours. It felt so unreal to her. How could she be leaving everything she'd ever known to get on a train and marry a man who was a stranger to her? She arrived at the train station with her bags in hand at 8:15, praying she was ready. She'd never done anything quite so rash, so she wasn't certain how she'd handle things. She had no idea what the man looked like or who he was, but she would be his bride in just 7 days. What kind of thinking human being agreed to something like that? The woman who sat beside her waiting on her train smiled at Meg. "You seem nervous. Have you never been on a train before?" "I have been on a train, but only once. I'm nervous because I'm going to be on a train for 7 days, and then I'm going to marry a stranger. I don't know what I was thinking to agree to do this." Meg stood up, looking around for an escape. She sat back down a moment later. She couldn't go back to her position as a teacher, because it had already been filled. She wouldn't anyway. The demon horde was not made up of children. They were beasts. The older woman laughed. "You never really know a man until you've been married to him anyway. You'll be fine." She patted Meg's hand. "I was a mail-order bride back in 1867, right after the war between the states. My father died in the war, and my brother couldn't support all of us, so I went out west as a bride. I settled in Minnesota, and married a kind, loving man. We've been married for almost 30 years. "Oh, that's wonderful. Is he with you?" The woman's eyes grew sad. "No, I was here because my mother grew ill. She died 2 weeks ago. It's not good news that she died by any means, but it does mean that I can now return home to John. I've been here for 3 months taking care of her. I'm so sorry about your mother." "Thank you, dear." The woman forced a smile. "I'm Gertrude, by the way. My friends call me Gertie." "And are we friends?" "We're about to have a long train ride together, so I certainly hope we are going to be." Meg laughed. "I'm Margaret, but my friends all call me Meg." "Meg. I like that. It suits you well." Their train was called then, and they both stood. "I'm not sure I'm ready to be on a train for this long." Meg was almost as nervous about the long train ride as she was about the marriage. Gertie smiled. "Trust me, it's better than being on a wagon for that long. You have to get out and walk beside the wagon, and when it's your turn to drive, your bottom gets so sore. No, this is a much better way of traveling. It's so much faster." Meg nodded. "I shouldn't complain about riding on a train. I know it's so much better than what people did even 60 years ago. This new age we live in is simply amazing." "It is. I'm glad you can recognize that." They found seats beside each other, and Meg settled into the trip. She pulled out the pieces of the apron she'd cut out and a needle and thread, determined to keep busy for at least a portion of the trip. "While you work, tell me what made you decide to be a mail-order bride. That's not something every pretty young lady just gets up and does." Once Meg started talking, she couldn't seem to stop. She told about working hard to get her teacher's certificate, and how proud she was. Then she talked about her first school, there outside Beckham. The children were mostly well-behaved, but there were these 4 children from one family. Meg realized she had a captive audience, and she detailed every prank the children had played and every fight they'd fought. When she got to the part where the oldest of the demon horde had laid the Grooms Gazette on her desk, Gertie gasped. "I've never heard of such horribly behaved children. I hope you got your ruler out and took that boy to task," Gertie said, fire in her eyes. "I considered it, but he was 17. He was at least 6 inches taller than me, and he was used to farm chores. He would have hurt me." Gertie shook her head. "It's not right that you were expected to deal with children like that on your own." "What did the parents say?" "I never could get them to come in and talk to me. I considered going to their house after school, but quite frankly, I was afraid to." Meg shook her head. "I never thought I'd admit that I was afraid of my students, but I was. And I could only imagine the parents being much worse. I mean, they were the ones allowing them to run wild that way. I don't know what you'd have run into there." "So you went to their older sister?" Meg finished up her story and sighed. "I haven't even had the courage to tell my parents that I'm off to North Dakota to marry a complete stranger. I know they wouldn't be pleased with me." "No, they probably wouldn't. Why, I'd be furious with my daughter for doing the same thing, even though I was a mail-order bride myself. It just doesn't seem like something my daughter should do. Back then it seemed the ultimate adventure. I don't know how safe it would be in today's world." Gertie frowned. "When you get to North Dakota, and you meet your Lars, you send me a letter straight away so I know you're there and you've arrived safely, and he hasn't hurt you or anything. I don't want to get home and worry about you nonstop. I promise." Gertie immediately wrote her address on a piece of paper, giving it to Meg. "May I help you make something?" she asked, eyeing Meg's project. Meg shook her head. "I only brought enough fabric for 1 apron to work on. I should have gotten more." "That's all right. We can chat while you work." By the time Gertie got off the train 6 days later, Meg had not only finished the apron, she had written long newsy letters to her parents about what she'd done, and she had written each of her siblings. She had read 2 books and spent many hours staring out the window. As Gertie's stop was called, Meg got to her feet, hugging the older woman tightly. "I'm so glad I got to know you. I will write as soon as I know he's not planning on murdering me in my sleep. I hope you don't mind having a pen friendship with me." "Mind? I insist. You're a special young lady, Meg. Don't let anyone ever tell you differently." Both women had tears in their eyes as they parted ways. A woman who had watched the 2 of them for a couple of days from the vantage point of the seat across from Meg, asked, "Was that your grandmother?" Meg laughed. "She's my new friend I met just before we got on the train in Massachusetts. I could have sworn you were related by how close you were. We were strangers a few days ago." Meg frowned. "I feel like she's always been a part of my life now, though." He frowned. "I wasn't planning on that. We're married. I have rights." He didn't need just a cook and housekeeper. He had physical needs, and as his wife, it was her duty to take care of them. "1 week is all I ask. I want to know you a bit better. I want to feel comfortable with you before I let you do that to me." She fumbled over her words, very embarrassed to be having this conversation with him. "Let me? You're my wife. It's your duty." She took a deep breath. "I realize that, and I plan to fulfill that duty. But I'd like a little more time to get used to you before we do that." "I suppose a week won't hurt me," he said grudgingly. "But no longer than a week. And during that week, I plan to kiss you whenever I feel like it." Whenever you feel like it? What if I'm busy? What could you be doing that was more important than kissing your husband?" She envisioned removing a roast from the oven and burning them both. "You won't do it when I'm holding something hot?" He laughed. I won't endanger either of us to kiss you. I'm not a stupid man. Their food arrived and was slid in front of them. I don't think you're stupid. I think you were very smart to warn whoever came here to marry you that you had no intention of ever loving her. Most women would have been scared away. All intelligent women would have. Well, you weren't, and I'm glad. I need a wife. I can't spend another winter alone. Is that the main reason you wanted a wife? She asked. Companionship? He shook his head, not willing to lie to her. I want a son. I want sex. I want decent meals. In that order. He knew his words were blunt, and he watched her to see if she'd run off. They were married, but an annulment would be easy at that point. She sighed. I see. Getting this man to fall in love with her would really be a challenge. It was a good thing she adored challenges. She took a bite of her stew with a grin. He wasn't going to know what hit him. Asterisk. After leaving the diner, they stopped at the mercantile, where the owner had a small tower of supplies stacked. I didn't get just your usual this month, Lars. I went with everything a newlywed couple usually needs. Lars nodded. Thanks, George. I appreciate it. He looked over at Meg. This is my new wife, Margaret. Meg, this is George. Meg smiled and nodded. It's nice to meet you. I look forward to seeing you for the monthly supply orders. Meg frowned, looking out on the prairie. What if the snow is too deep to come out? We'll bring the sleigh, Lars said. You can stay home if it's too cold for you, but I can't miss my supply runs. I have George put in extra in case I'm a week late due to weather, but we can't go much longer than that. Meg wondered what would happen if they were trapped out on the prairie with no food, but she didn't ask. Lars seemed to read her mind. If we were stuck out there, I would hunt for food. There's always something to shoot, or I would kill one of our milk cows if it got terribly bad, though I'd prefer not to. I see. So there's always a plan if something goes wrong. Of course. I've lived here for 8 years now. I know what I'm doing. Mostly. George laughed at that. He knows pretty well how to keep alive. When the wagon was loaded, Lars and Meg left town and headed toward the farm. It's about 2 hours from here. You can sleep if you need to. She shook her head. That's all I did for the last 24 hours on the train after my new friend left. What was your friend's name? He asked. He wouldn't get to know her any better by asking her about the stranger she'd made friends with on the train. That would give them something to talk about without bringing them closer together. Meg told him everything she knew about her new friend, Gertie, as they drove. I wish she didn't live so far from here. She is a kind woman, and I'd love to learn more from her. You'll find we live far from everyone. The closest farm is a 20-minute drive. Oh. Somehow she'd imagined there would be someone close enough that she could walk to their home and talk to them. Apparently not. Are you disappointed? He asked. I said in the letter that I was isolated. I guess I didn't realize just how isolated you were. It's going to feel like we're the only 2 people on Earth. Do you go into town on Sundays for church? She asked. He shook his head. I can't drive 4 hours just to sit in a church building for 2 hours. It doesn't make sense. No, I guess it doesn't. I will miss church, though. He frowned. I wish it were some other way. Maybe more people will settle, and we can start a church out here. Maybe. She looked at him, considering. I have never eaten Norwegian food, so if you are wanting me to cook that way, I'll need a cookbook or something. Otherwise, I will cook what I know. Anything you cook will be better than anything I've tried to cook over the years. I'll be very happy with anything you make for me. He glanced at her with a slight smile. Thank you for thinking of my heritage. I do appreciate it. I thought about buying a Norwegian cookbook and learning some dishes before I came, but I didn't know how to do that. She shrugged. How did you come to be in North Dakota? He briefly told her of how he'd been a farmer in Norway, and how hard it was. He'd been trying to farm wheat, just as his father had tried to farm wheat. There just wasn't enough farmland in all of Norway. So when I saw an advertisement offering land and an inexpensive trip to North Dakota, I jumped at it. It was a wise decision. And he still felt it was wise, even after what had happened to Olga and their son. He knew someday he would need to tell her about Olga, but he didn't feel like their wedding day was the right time. It's already getting very cold here, she said, snuggling into her coat. She was glad she'd worn it. I was hoping it would be a bit warmer than Massachusetts, but I didn't expect it to be. He laughed. Any land with the word North as part of the name cannot be expected to be warm. She shook her head. North Carolina is quite warm. I had a student from there, and she talked often about how cold Massachusetts was in comparison. Tell me about your time teaching, he said, looking for a way to keep her talking. He found he enjoyed listening to her, but he had no desire to tell her about his own life. She might be able to stay distracted that way. She told him a series of stories that had him laughing harder than he remembered laughing for a long time. Maybe since he left Norway. And people really call these children the demon horde? Yes. There's no other way to describe them. And for me, the funniest part is their older sister, Elizabeth, is the one who sent me here to marry you. She is a lovely woman and a matchmaker. She's truly made something of herself. She told me that the oldest 4 children in the family were actually well behaved, and it was the youngest 10 who made up the demon horde. All of the ones who are grown have become good people. They're married and work hard. I cannot imagine any of those children I taught doing anything but causing problems. They were bad. I was almost afraid to walk into my classroom, because I never knew what was going to happen when I did. I have a hard time believing that children who behaved so badly could grow up to be anything but disrespectful, rude adults. It seems odd to me. And yes, it's strange that Elizabeth is their older sister. Who would have thought? Does she have children? Meg smiled. She had a son a couple of weeks ago. It's their first. Oh, that's nice. He didn't look at her, afraid she'd see the intense longing for a son to take over his land in his eyes. He'd already told her he'd married her primarily to get a son, so she shouldn't have a problem with it. Chapter 4. When he was close enough for her to see the house, he stopped the wagon and took her arm, pointing into the distance. Do you see a small house over there? The chimney is visible. The house is made of wood, and it is painted white. He never would have painted the house white, but he knew it's what Olga wanted, and he did everything he could to keep her happy. He wouldn't pander to the whims of his new wife the way he had his first. Oh, I see it. It was little more than a speck off to the distance, but she could see it. Her new home. She couldn't remember the last house she'd seen, so they would truly be as isolated as he'd said. She'd hoped he was exaggerating a bit, but apparently not. How much longer before we get there? She asked. About 15 minutes. You can see far on the prairie without trees to block the way. I'm going to miss having trees all around me. Massachusetts has trees everywhere. You'll get used to it. It's a nice place to live. He shrugged. The farmland is so much better here than it ever was back home in Norway. I'm glad I made the long journey. She sighed, wondering how long it would take her to be able to say she was glad she'd moved west, if ever. He seemed like a kind enough man, but there didn't seem to be any warmth or emotion about him. It made her sad to know he was the only person she'd see every single day for years to come. Yes, they'd occasionally go into town, but that was a long journey. She wanted to have a friend close by. She kept her eyes peeled on the house, looking at it carefully, wanting to know everything about it. It was beautiful from here, and it was bigger than she'd imagined it would be. Was it 2 stories? She couldn't tell from there. When he finally stopped in front of it, she wanted to jump down on her own, but she sensed he wouldn't like that. She was used to getting in and out of wagons on her own, but she wasn't used to being married as she did it. "Your house is lovely." He smiled, thankful for the comment. When she got inside, she wouldn't feel the same, he was sure. He wasn't good at keeping the house tidy like Olga had, and he hadn't done dishes in a very long time. He hoped she didn't get as angry as she probably should. "You go in. I'll follow with your bags," he told her. He didn't want to see the disappointment on her face when she saw how filthy the house was. Meg hurried ahead, throwing the door open, and taking a deep breath. There were dishes piled all over the kitchen, and there was dirt all over the floors. It had obviously once been loved by someone, because there were curtains at the windows. They were dirty curtains, but they were curtains. She wandered through the house, seeing that there was not only an upstairs, but there was a proper staircase. It wasn't a ladder leading up there. She told herself to be thankful for the good things, and not fuss over the mess. There was one bedroom at the foot of the stairs, and she looked into it. It was obviously his. The sheets were quite dirty, and there were clothes all over the floor. The first things she would need to do were laundry and dishes. Before those 2 tasks were handled, she wouldn't even be able to really get started on anything else. There was another room there on the bottom floor, and she looked into it. It was relatively clean, except for the dust on everything. It was a parlor, and she could imagine spending happy evenings there, crocheting or sewing while he did whatever men like to do in the evenings. Her days would be full for a while at least. That was good. It had to be. She climbed the stairs to find 2 bedrooms at the top. One looked like it was meant to be a spare bedroom, complete with an unmade bed and a dresser. The other room was a nursery. She frowned. That nursery had a great deal of dust on it. Why would a single man build a nursery as soon as he built the house? Surely he'd wait until he had a wife. And then it all clicked in Meg's mind. He'd been married before. That's why the house had once been loved by someone. That's why there was a nursery. And more importantly, that's why he said he would never love again. It all made sense to her now, even though she didn't want it to. She climbed back down the stairs slowly, not sure how to broach the subject with him, so she didn't. He'd gone into his bedroom and closed the door, so she removed her coat, pulled her apron over her dress, and rolled up her sleeves. If she could do even a portion of the dishes tonight, she would be able to get more done tomorrow. Lars came out of his room wearing work clothes. "I'm going to go out and milk the cow and gather the eggs. I will be back." She was pleased to hear she'd have fresh eggs and milk every day for her cooking and baking. She watched him go, a sad look on her face. How long would he wait before he told her about his lost wife? She stood at the sink, thankful for the water pump. She wouldn't have to make trips out to the well to do dishes and laundry, and that would make her life much easier than it would have been. By the time he was back from milking the cows and gathering eggs, she'd made serious strides in the work at hand. She had many of the dishes washed, and all the pots that had food caked on them, which was all the pots in the house, were soaking. She wiped off the table and scrubbed out a skillet. They'd had a late lunch, so he didn't know if he'd want to eat again that night. If he did, she could make some bacon and eggs or some pancakes. "Are you hungry?" she asked as he set the milk on the table and put a basket of eggs beside the pail. "I could make something simple tonight like bacon and eggs or pancakes." His eyes lit up. "Pancakes? It's been a really long time since I had pancakes." He went to the boxes he'd carried in from the mercantile and found some flour and some maple syrup. "George knows I love maple syrup." He had gotten a new bottle every month when he picked up supplies while Olga was still alive. She smiled and nodded. Pancakes it is. Looking around, she found the other ingredients she'd need. She took a mixing bowl she had just put away and quickly mixed the batter, spooning 4 circles onto the large skillet. He looked around the room. It was already looking much better than it had in 2 years. She'd done a good portion of the dishes and cleaned off the table. He'd gotten into the habit of moving the dishes around on the table and eating in smaller and smaller spaces until he was forced to do dishes or eat from pots. When she set the first plate of pancakes in front of him, he wished she'd had time to make butter in the churn, but because she hadn't, he picked up the syrup and covered them. Then he leaned in and just smelled them. It was going to be a treat not to eat his own cooking. Apparently she knew how to cook some of his favorites as well. She made pancakes until the batter was gone, refilling his plate twice. Finally, she sat down with the last 2 pancakes and a glass of milk for herself. "Do you like French toast as well?" she asked. "What's that?" She shrugged. "It's just a way of using up older bread. You dip the bread in a mixture of milk and eggs, and then you fry it like you would a pancake. You serve it with butter and syrup. If it has syrup, I will eat it." He didn't know why he had such a love for all sweet foods, but he did. "Then I'll make those when I need to use up bread." "That won't happen." She frowned at him. "Why not?" "Because I haven't had fresh baked bread in so long. I don't think I'll be able to stop eating it once I start." "It sounds delicious, though." She laughed. "I'll make a bit of extra and hide it, just so I can make you some French toast." "How would that be?" "It sounds lovely. I should have married a long time ago, just so I could eat good food again." "I'll do my best to keep you happy." She hadn't taken the time to dig through all the supplies from the store yet, because she didn't want to put them into a dirty kitchen. She'd clean out the pantry and make sure everything was spotless before she started to put the food in there. When he'd finished eating, he leaned back and patted his belly. "That was delicious." "Thank you." She smiled, getting up and taking both of their plates to the sink, and immediately started another round of dishwashing. He watched her, wondering when she'd start berating him for the mess he'd left, but she never did. She did every dirty dish he had left out, drying them and putting them away. Then she took all the pots she had soaking, and she washed the ones she could easily wash. She set the others onto the stove. "I'll have to boil those to get the food off, and that can wait until tomorrow. For now, I'm tired." He got to his feet. "If you still want to sleep alone, there's a bedroom upstairs you can use. You're welcome to share my bed, of course, but I can't promise I won't touch you. I'll use the bed upstairs for tonight, thank you." She smiled at him, wondering how she was supposed to say goodnight to the husband she'd met only a few hours earlier. Really, it was out of her realm of experience. Lars caught her hand, pulling her toward him. At her wary look, he shook his head. "I just want to kiss you goodnight. You did say I could kiss you whenever the mood struck me." She nodded, raising her face to his, expecting the same slight brush of the lips he'd given her in church. He cupped her face in his hands, leaning down and touching his lips to hers. When he'd kissed her in the church, there'd been no real spark between them, and as much as he didn't want to love the woman, he did want the passion she could show him. He lifted his head after a very brief kiss, rubbing his thumb over her lower lip as he looked into her eyes. "Have you ever been kissed before?" She nodded. "You kissed me at the church, remember?" He chuckled softly. "That wasn't a real kiss. That was just a touch of my lips on yours." "Have you ever had a real kiss?" "I'm not sure what you mean." "Why wasn't that a real kiss?" "Let me show you." His head lowered again, and this time his lips played with hers. His tongue stroked her bottom lip, seeking entrance into her mouth. Meg was unsure what he wanted, but when she parted her lips to ask, his tongue swooped in, showing her in a way that was much more effective than any explanation ever could be. Lars let out a groan, his hands moving from where they still cupped her cheeks to her tiny waist as he pulled her flush against him. There was the spark he needed. He wanted her badly. He wanted to drag her into his bedroom and demand his rights as a husband, but that was no way to get her to acquiesce. No, he'd take things slowly, and when he did make it into bed with her, she would want it as much as he did. Finally he lifted his head, his forehead resting against hers. Now do you understand the difference? Meg nodded, slightly out of breath. I had no idea people kissed that way. She was embarrassed to admit it, but at least he would understand how inexperienced she was. Good night, Lars. Good night, Meg. He touched his lips to hers briefly. I will see you in the morning. He walked off toward his room, wondering how he was going to keep his heart from being taken by her. He thought he had buried it with Olga, but his lust and his love were too closely knit. He shut the door softly behind him, trying to force his heart to stop its erratic beating. He would have to quit thinking of her as anything more than a housekeeper and cook, a vessel for his seed. She would bear his son, but she would get no affection. Outside his room, Meg stood frozen. She had felt more from that kiss than she'd ever imagined was possible. He'd touched her lips, her heart, and her soul. How on earth could a man make her feel so much in such a short time? She slowly climbed the stairs to her empty room. She couldn't find any clean sheets, so she put a quilt over the mattress and folded it in half, lying on half and covering with the other half. She didn't bother changing into her nightgown, knowing she wouldn't be warm enough. It was warmer downstairs near the fire. She lay for a while with her eyes wide open staring at the wall. What would life be like when she allowed him more than a kiss? He was hiding so much from her, denying his first wife and a child, she was certain. She understood why his heart was off limits to her, but she wanted him to voice the words to her. Telling her would be the right thing to do, and he seemed like such a good, honest man who always did the right thing. When she closed her eyes, she saw nothing but his face. His eyes as they looked down into hers. Her lips still tingled from his touch. She could feel on her sides where he'd gripped her waist. Never had she thought she would be attracted to a man like him. A good little Irish girl was never interested in a man who wasn't from the Emerald Isle. While her family may be disappointed in her for marrying, and especially for marrying a Norwegian man she'd never met, she didn't care. Something about the sad, lonely man touched her heart. Sure, she had a lot to do to take care of him, and to get his house in order, and he was so brooding he could easily make her crazy, but one touch and she melted like sugar in his arms. She only hoped she would be able to hold out for a full week, and take the opportunity to get to know him as she wished. Maybe it was folly on her part, but she felt that once that part of their marriage started, the courtship would end, and she desperately wanted the courtship. Meg had always dreamed of a man who would sing her love songs, who would bring her flowers. She had never met a man willing to do either, but now she'd married, she had a chance for it to happen. At least, she hoped she did. He seemed to be so distant from her, except when they touched. He was willing to share his body with her, but she could tell he would need persuasion to share his heart. She was an Irishwoman at heart, and she firmly believed that a man's heart should be held firmly by a woman before she agreed to spend a night in his bed. There was no hope of getting him to agree to such a thing. No, he wanted to hold himself away. She could only do what was within her abilities. She'd clean and cook for him. She would make his home a place where he could be proud to bring people. Anything beyond that was impossible. Perhaps she could find a tender spot by making special meals for him, or cleaning up the things his first wife had put out everywhere. Maybe that was what it would take. Maybe making sure he knew she respected his feelings for the woman who'd come before her would be all it would take. It was hard to know, because she barely knew him, but that wouldn't continue. She would not spend her life married to a stranger. Meg Borgen was going to have the love of her man. She didn't care what it took. Once she'd decided on a course of action, she finally closed her eyes. Tomorrow, she would make him love her. Chapter 5. Meg woke even earlier than usual the following morning, convinced that if she showed him how hard she would work, he would realize he could love her. She tiptoed down the stairs and quickly made bacon, eggs, and pancakes for breakfast. She wouldn't always go overboard on everything, but she would until he started to love her. She knew she could make it happen. She put a pot of coffee on, assuming he drank it because it was in the supplies, and set the table. She looked around the kitchen at all that was left to do in just that room. She needed to scrub the floor, several pots, and the walls. The stove needed to be blacked badly. She was certain it hadn't been done in at least 2 years. She yawned, wishing she could go back to bed just thinking about it all. Today would be a day for cleaning the kitchen, baking bread, and doing laundry. She wanted every piece of laundry in the house clean and on the line before noon. It may not be possible, but she was certainly going to try. She had breakfast on the table, just as the front door opened. She jumped, startled. "Got fresh milk and eggs," Lars said, setting them on the work table. He walked to her and kissed her softly. He didn't sink into the kiss as he wanted to. He needed to keep his distance, and kissing, for whatever reason, made him feel more for her. How he'd talk her into his bed early without kissing her a lot, he didn't know, but he'd figure that out. Soon. "Breakfast is ready," she said with a smile. "How do you take your coffee?" "Black," he replied, watching as she poured his coffee into a cup and set it beside his plate. She'd gone all out for breakfast. He couldn't remember a time someone had fixed both eggs and pancakes for the same meal, but he certainly wouldn't complain about it. It all looked delicious. "I'll try to find time to make butter today, but I think there are other things that are a little more important." He sighed but nodded. "I do have some food in the cellar. There are some canned goods I purchased a while back, and some potatoes and some carrots. Maybe even a pumpkin or two if you like pumpkin pie." She took her seat across from him, grinning. "So you want me to make pumpkin pie? Is that what you're saying?" He shrugged. "Only if you like it, of course." He wouldn't ask her to go out of her way to make something special for him, because he wouldn't ever return the favor. He couldn't. "Of course. Any apples down there?" He shook his head. "Apples are hard to come by around here. I planted some of the seeds I've gotten when I bought them from George in town, but they haven't grown much yet. You'll need to show me where they are, so I can do my best to fertilize them and keep them going." She took a bite of her eggs, watching him as she ate. "What kind of farmer are you?" Lars frowned. "A good one, I hope." She shook her head. "No, I mean, what do you grow?" "Oh, I'm a wheat farmer." "This is good land for wheat." "I see." She didn't know much about wheat except that it was ground to make flour. "Is there anything in particular you're hungry for? Anything you want special for supper tonight?" He shook his head. "We'll worry about special meals after you've had some time to get the house where it needs to be. I've been seeing a lot of deer, so I might bring you one so you can make some stews." "Do you know how to dry meat?" "No, I don't. If you show me once, I can learn though. I have a spring house I use for keeping meat fresh. I'll show you before I go out today. Then you can choose what you want to fix." He finished the last of his breakfast, wiping his mouth on the back of his sleeve. "Are you finished?" Meg looked at her plate. No, she wasn't nearly finished, but she'd go with him. "I'm ready." She followed him outside, and he explained the buildings to her. "That's the chicken coop," he said of a small sod building. "The chickens wander in and out, but I've used some of the new barbed wire to keep predators out as best I can. He showed her a small barn, this building made of wood. I keep 2 cows in here, and my 4 horses. I have 2 teams. One is mostly for driving, and the other is for farm work. I see. Will I need to feed the animals? He shook his head. The only outside work I'll ask of you is to keep a kitchen garden, come spring and summer. You'll grow most of the food we eat. It'll save us a lot of money at the mercantile in the fall and winter. She nodded. I expected that. He took her to the well. We have the pump in the kitchen, but if it acts up, just come out here and bring water up from the well. I can do that, Meg told him. She hoped she'd have time to churn butter that day, and she'd work quickly to make it happen if at all possible. She could make a simple stew for supper, to take less time so she could manage it. He took her to the other building that was again made of mud. It was barely tall enough for him to fit into. This is the spring house. I rerouted a bit of the stream through here, to keep meat cold enough. I got fresh meat in town yesterday. George got it from the butcher and added it to our order. I brought it in here before going into the house last night. She looked around the building, noting the meat in the water. She rubbed her hands over her arms to warm them. Is there anything in particular you want me to get started on today? He shook his head. There's a lot to do, and I appreciate you being so willing to get started. Do what you can and leave the rest. Meg nodded, watching as he walked away at those words. He was off to work, and she was expected to do her share now. It was a good thing she'd bought a Pioneer handbook back in Massachusetts before she left. It wouldn't tell her everything, of course, but it would get her started. Wait. Will you be home for lunch? Lars turned around. He didn't want to come home for lunch. He didn't want to see her that often, but he would be hungry. Yes, I'll be home for lunch today. After today, I'd appreciate if you could pack a lunch pail for me. Of course. Meg hurried into the house to get the dishes done. She'd start the stew right away and make it big enough they could eat it for both meals that day. She'd make him sandwiches for lunch tomorrow. She could be a wife. She just needed to learn what he expected of her. She hurried into the house and finished her breakfast before doing all the dishes that were left. She was able to scrub out the rest of the pots after they'd soaked overnight, and she put a large one on the stove before hurrying out to the spring house to find some meat. When she stepped into the small building, she shivered again. It was just as cold in there as it was outside, and it was almost freezing outside. She found what looked like beef to her, and she carried a 2-pound portion into the house and chopped it into pieces. She put it into a large pot and added enough water to cover it, wanting the meat cooked before she added the vegetable for the stew. She then put a pot of water on to boil for the laundry. She was not looking forward to dealing with all of the dirty clothes and bedding, but it had to be done first. She stripped the curtains off the windows, and even found a tablecloth wadded up in one of the kitchen cabinets. She spent over an hour with a scrub board, thankful she didn't have to beat her laundry against a rock. She hadn't been sure he would have a scrub board, but after a bit of searching, she found it. Apparently his wife had everything she'd needed to do her job well. Once everything was hanging on the line, she hurried back into the house and down to the cellar, carrying up potatoes and carrots for the stew. She peeled and cut up the potatoes and carrots and seasoned the water, mixing a little flour with water and adding that into the pot to thicken it. She smiled, looking down at it. It would be perfect, and ready by the time he came in for lunch. She glanced at the clock and saw it was already 10:30, and she felt like she'd accomplished so little. She took everything out of the pantry and scrubbed it, carefully deciding where she would put each of the things they'd purchased at the mercantile. When she had it just like she wanted it, she scrubbed the fronts of the cabinets and the table again. She'd put the tablecloth she'd found on the table before supper, and it would start to feel like home. Glancing at the clock, she saw she still had 30 minutes before he should be there for lunch, assuming he'd eat at noon. I wish he'd told me what time he'd come back, but at least lunch will be ready whenever he makes it. She talked to herself as she mixed up bread dough, kneading it on the work table. She made enough bread for 3 loaves, draping a towel over the mixing bowl so the dough could rise. She cleaned up the small mess she'd made mixing the dough, and washed her hands. She hated how much bread dough clung to her hands when she was baking. By keeping busy, she'd been able to keep her loneliness at bay. She really hoped she could get some kind of pet, so she wouldn't be alone all the time, but that was something they could discuss at a later time. For now, she had enough work to do that she shouldn't even notice the loneliness. Lars came into the house at 12:30, sniffing deeply. Something smelled wonderful. When Olga was alive, he'd have rushed to her and hugged her, telling her how good it smelled. "Something smells nice," he said, knowing he needed to compliment her work, even if she wasn't his first wife. Meg turned from her spot at the stove. "I'm glad you think so, because this is lunch and supper today." Lars walked to the sink and washed his hands, using the cake of soap on the edge of the work counter. He was happy to see she was a woman who kept her surroundings clean. He'd had no idea what he was getting when he asked for a mail-order bride. "I could eat that for lunch and supper every day for a week and not tire of it." She grinned. "Maybe you should try a bite before you say that." He shrugged. "It smells good, and I'm not a picky eater. I wouldn't have survived eating my own cooking if I was." Sitting at the table, he waited for her to bring him a bowl of the stew. "What would you like to drink with lunch? I can make more coffee or milk." "Water?" "Water is fine for lunch. I prefer milk with supper and coffee with breakfast." He waited as she put the water in front of him, and took a big swallow. "When you make my lunch tomorrow, send me out with a couple of jars of water as well. I'll need them." Meg nodded, serving herself some stew and a glass of milk. She sat opposite him and took a bite of her stew, smiling with pride. It tasted as good as her mother's. That's all she cared about with a stew. "What did you do this morning?" she asked. He frowned at her. He shouldn't have to talk about his work. "I plowed the fields, so they would be ready to plant in the spring. I tried to get everything done before the first snow flies." "Has there been snow here yet?" she asked curiously. They'd had one snowfall in Massachusetts before she left, but it hadn't been a big one. "Not yet. Soon." He ate quickly, ready to get back to his plowing. "I'll finish work by about 6:30. He told her, standing and putting his hat back on. "I'll see you then." He walked out of the house without even thanking her for making his lunch. She made a face. If he couldn't be even a little bit thankful for her hard work, she might have to get angry with him. Of course, she hadn't thanked him for plowing the fields to earn a living for them, so maybe he needed to be shown what she expected. She'd do that later. Meg did the lunch dishes, punched down the dough, and put it into bread pans to rise again, carefully covering the pans with a towel. Then she got back to work on the house. After scrubbing the kitchen floor, she turned to the walls, washing them briskly. She'd wait to blacken the stove. It needed it, but she had too many other things that were more important. Walking outside, she checked the clothes on the line, realized they weren't dry enough to take down yet, and then she went back inside. She found the butter churn in the corner of the kitchen and frowned at it. It was much too dirty for her to be able to use. She cleaned it out, and then got the cream from the last couple of days that was saved in the basement. Thankful they even had a basement to keep things cool, she poured the cream into the churn and began the long process of churning the butter. She'd helped her mother do it more than once, but she'd forgotten that her arms would begin to ache well before the butter was ready. When she was finished, she put the butter into 2 bowls and poured the buttermilk into a pitcher. She wasn't fond of buttermilk, but if Lars was, she wanted him to be able to have it. If he wasn't, they could pour it over the chicken feed. She put the bread into the oven and went down into the basement, getting a pumpkin. She knew he wanted pumpkin pie, and though she wasn't a pumpkin pie lover, she would make sure he had some. She'd even take the cream from the cows that evening to make whipped cream to top it with. She sang to herself as she got the meat of the pumpkin out, cutting it into chunks. She'd never actually made a pumpkin pie, but she had it in her recipe book. Before she moved out of her mother's house, she'd been presented with all of her mother's recipes written down for her in a notebook. She was thankful for that now, though she thought her mother was being silly at the time. She removed the bread from the oven, smiling at the perfect loaves. It was her first time to bake bread without her mother standing over her, so she was happy it had turned out so well. Back in Beckham, it had been easier to buy her bread from the baker in town than make her own. She'd had the extra money to do what she wanted, because her house had been provided. The small school had paid more than most, but she understood as soon as she started why it had. They knew the kind of children they were asking her to deal with. Meg sighed and pushed her failure as a teacher from her mind. She'd never realized just how badly she would feel leaving the job half done. She finished up the pie and slipped it into the oven, smiling to herself. Already having accomplished more than she'd intended to do all day, she went back out to get the clothes in off the line. They were finally dry, thanks to the strong wind blowing across the prairie. While she was removing a sheet, she heard a soft animal cry from the direction of the house. She walked over and found a tiny kitten, barely old enough to be weaned, hiding under a bush. She picked it up, holding it close. "I bet you'll be a good mouser in a few months, but more importantly, you'll be a good companion now. Why don't you live with me?" She snuggled the kitten under her chin, giggling when its fur tickled her. "What should we name you?" She thought for a moment. "That's it. I'll call you Beth." Beth was everyone's favorite in Little Women, and she was Meg's little sister. "I was named after Meg, so you can be named after Beth." She slid the kitten into the pocket of her skirt and went back to the clothesline, removing the rest of the laundry. "You can help me with my chores and keep me company all day while Lars is out working." She made up both beds with fresh sheets and blankets, thankful to have something clean for her bed. The quilts were clean too, and she wouldn't feel dirty as she slept under them. There was no better feeling in the world than sliding between fresh, clean sheets. The kitten followed her as she made up the beds, and Meg giggled as she learned to climb the stairs. Beth was afraid to follow her when she went back down, so she scooped her up and carried her. She spread the tablecloth over the table and hung the curtains back on the windows. The house looked a great deal better already, and she hadn't had any time to start on the small parlor at the back of the house or the bedrooms yet. She wasn't sure how he'd feel about her cleaning the little nursery, but she was going to do it. There was no way she'd let another inch of dust accumulate on it. Her own child would sleep in that room someday.